The silence in the great hall was a living thing. It wasn't an empty silence, but a heavy one, packed with years of applause and the ghosts of 1,000 perfect notes. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, making you aware of every breath you take and every beat of your own heart. The air itself seemed thick with the scent of old wood, rosin, and the faint, metallic hint of dust motes dancing in the single blade of light that cut through the gloom from a high window. On the vast, empty stage, the polished wood gleamed like a dark mirror, reflecting the dim, ghostly glow of the vacant music stands down in the auditorium. Seated at a long table draped in black velvet was the reason for that tension, expectant silence. Maestro Vincenzo De Luca. He was a man carved from granite and old-world tradition, his face a roadmap of a life spent in the relentless pursuit of musical truth. His dark, piercing eyes missed nothing. He had just listened to a young man, no older than 25, play a passage of Elgar with a technical perfection that was, by all accounts, breathtaking. Every note was a jewel, precisely cut and flawlessly placed. The audition committee, a collection of the orchestra's principal players, had nodded in quiet approval. But the maestro had sat perfectly still, his expression unmoved. When the final, soaring note faded, the young musician held his pose, his chest puffed out, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He had done it. He had played the part perfectly. But the maestro did not say bravo. He did not say thank you. He simply waited, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the young man's smile began to waver. De Luca let the silence hang there for a moment longer, a tool he used to carve away at a performer's confidence, to see what lay beneath the surface polish. And what he saw beneath this one was nothing, just more polish. A beautiful, hollow shell. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that held no warmth. The two words were not a compliment. They were a dismissal. The young violinist's face fell, a flicker of confusion and hurt crossing his features before he could mask it. He bowed stiffly and gathered his instrument, his footsteps echoing hollowly as he left the stage. De Luca let out a soft, barely audible sigh, turning to the first violinist beside him. "He plays the notes," he whispered in Italian, "but he does not know why they exist." It was his constant complaint, his lifelong frustration. He was drowning in a sea of perfect, passionless musicians. He wasn't looking for a technician. He was searching for a poet, someone who could make the centuries-old wood and horsehair weep or sing or rage. The door at the very back of the hall, a heavy, soundproofed thing, creaked open. A sliver of daylight from the lobby cut across the dark velvet of the seats, and a figure shuffled in. It was not the energetic, confident stride of a young hopeful. This was the slow, measured walk of an older man. A murmur of quiet confusion rippled through the small committee. They all recognized him from the headshots and resumes they had been given. Arthur Pinter, 67 years old, a retired instrument repairman. The application had been a curiosity, a joke almost, filed away until the very end of a long day of auditions. As Arthur moved down the aisle, the dim light revealed more of him. His hair was a soft, thinning white, and his face was a gentle landscape of wrinkles, each one seeming to tell a story of quiet laughter or thoughtful contemplation. He wore a tweed jacket that had seen better decades, the elbows worn smooth, and the color faded in places. He didn't carry the sleek, modern case of a professional. His cello case was a battered old friend, covered in scuffs, dents, and dark stains that looked suspiciously like coffee or maybe even motor oil. It had the kind of character that could only be earned over a lifetime of faithful service. He moved with an unhurried calm, stark contrast to the nervous energy that usually filled the room. He didn't seem to feel the weight of the maestro's gaze or the curiosity of the committee. His focus was entirely on the stage. He walked up the 3 steps, not with the spring of an athlete, but with the steady, sure-footedness of a craftsman climbing a familiar set of stairs. He found the center chair, the very one the last musician had vacated, and paused. For a moment he just stood there, looking out at the empty hall, at the shadows in the high balcony, as if greeting an old friend. From his seat, the maestro watched this whole procession with a growing sense of disdain. He leaned slightly toward his concertmaster, a gesture of incredulity. The corner of his mouth twitched, pulling itself into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. It was the look of a man who has seen it all and is now being presented with a quaint but ultimately foolish curiosity. To him, this was an insult to the art form, a hobbyist wandering into a place of worship. He imagined the man in his workshop, sanding a bridge or gluing a crack, humming simple folk tunes to himself. The idea of him sitting on this stage, attempting to fill this sacred space with music, was absurd. The concertmaster offered a tight, knowing smile in return. The other committee members exchanged glances, a shared, silent judgment passing between them. They would get this over with quickly, a courtesy to an old man. And then they could all go home. Arthur seemed completely oblivious to this undercurrent of condescension. He carefully lowered his cello case to the floor with a gentle thud, the sound muted by the thick carpet of the stage. He undid the worn brass latches, the pop of each one echoing softly in the silence. He lifted the lid, and for a moment he just looked inside, a look of profound tenderness on his face. He then pulled out the instrument. It was not a gleaming varnished showpiece. This was an old cello. Its wood a deep, honey gold, darkened in places by the oil of countless hands. It had a story written all over it. He placed the cello gently, its end pin poised on the stage floor. Then he took his own chair, a simple wooden stool he had brought himself, and adjusted it with meticulous care. He wasn't in a hurry. Every movement had a purpose and a quiet dignity. He finally sat down, settling his body against the familiar curve of the instrument. It was not the posture of a performer trying to impress an audience. It was the posture of a man coming home. He took a moment to tune the cello, his ear pressed close to the strings, his fingers turning the pegs with a practiced, gentle touch. The maestro watched, his smirk now a full-blown expression of impatience. He was tapping his pen on the table, a soft, rhythmic click that was the only sound besides Arthur's subtle tuning. To the maestro, this old man was a waste of his precious time. But Arthur, in his own quiet world, was simply preparing to speak the only language he had ever truly loved. The smirk on the director's face said this was a joke. Arthur's quiet focus said it was everything. Arthur Pinter could feel the silent judgment rolling towards him from the darkened rows of seats. It wasn't a new feeling. It was a familiar chill, one he had felt countless times in his life, a cold breeze of underestimation. It was the same look the bank manager gave him when he applied for a loan to buy his little shop, the same tone the salesman at the hardware store used with him. Assuming he wouldn't know the difference between a good tool and a bad one. But this feeling was different. It was sharper, more concentrated, because it came from people who lived and breathed music, the very thing he held most sacred in the world for 40 years. Arthur's world had not been concert halls, but a small, cluttered workshop tucked away on a quiet side street. The air there was thick with the sweet, sharp scent of spruce and maple, the earthy smell of aged wood shavings, and the pungent aroma of hide glue warming in an old pot. It was a place of quiet order, of patience. His hands, which now rested on the strings of his cello, were not the hands of a pampered artist. They were the hands of a craftsman. The skin was tough and calloused. The nails were short and clean but never manicured, and there were tiny, silvery scars scattered across them like constellations, the souvenirs of a slip of a chisel here, the prick of a sharp tool there his life's work was mending. He was a luthier, a doctor to the wounded wooden souls of the string world. Violins, violas, cellos, they all passed through his door, brought to him by everyone from anxious students to world-famous soloists. He knew their secrets. He could feel the life inside a piece of wood, tell if it was from a cold, slow-growing forest or a warm, sunny one. He understood the tension of the strings, the fragile balance of the soundpost hidden within, the tiny pressure of the bridge that transferred the vibration from the strings to the belly of the instrument, giving it its voice. He didn't just fix cracks and replace broken parts. He listened to them. He would hold an old violin, close his eyes, and feel the vibrations travel up his arm, trying to understand its character. Some were bright and cheerful, some were dark and moody. Some were tired and needed to be coaxed back to life. His shop was a sanctuary. It was where he felt most himself. But his true love, the one thing that fueled his passion for his work, was not fixing instruments, but playing them. His love for the cello was a legacy, a gift passed down from his father. His father was a man who worked with his hands too, in a loud, dusty factory that smelled of oil and metal. Every evening he would come home, his face gray with exhaustion, his hands covered in grease. He would wash them, then pick up his own old second-hand cello. He couldn't read music. Not really. He played by ear the simple folk songs of his homeland, melodies that were filled with a longing for a place he had left behind. For a young boy, watching his father transform from a weary factory worker into a musician was a kind of magic. The big, tired man would disappear, and in his place was someone who spoke a beautiful, secret language. His father taught him the cello not with sheet music, but with stories and feelings. "Don't just play the note, Artie," he would say, his voice raspy from a long day's work. "Find the story inside it. This one is about a bird trying to fly out of a cage. This one is about the rain on the window when you're missing someone." His father taught him that music wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. It was about the breath between the notes, the silence that gave the sound its meaning. He taught him that a slight waver in the tone wasn't a mistake if it came from the heart. It was humanity. It was the sound of a hand that had known hard work, heart that had known both joy and sorrow. Arthur had the talent to pursue it professionally. His teachers had told him so. He had a gift, a natural touch, and an emotional depth that was rare for someone so young. But life has a way of arranging its own plans. He met Eleanor, a woman with a laugh like wind chimes and eyes that held the entire universe. He fell in love, and they built a life together. Then came the children. 3 beautiful, noisy, wonderful children who needed shoes and food and a roof over their heads. A career in music felt like a selfish dream, a gamble he couldn't afford to take. So, he did what he had to do. He apprenticed with an old luthier, learned the trade, and opened his own shop. He provided for his family. He was a good husband, a good father, and at night, after the children were asleep and the shop was dark and still, he would take out his cello. He would close his eyes, and his father would be there with him, and he would play. He played for Eleanor, for his children, for his tired father in that old factory town. He played for all the things he couldn't say out loud. The cello became his diary, his confidant, his private solace. The music was never for anyone else. It was just for him. It was a language he spoke only to himself in the quiet, sacred hours when the rest of the world was asleep. For 40 years, that's how it was. His cello, his father's cello, was his most trusted secret. Its wood was smooth and worn in all the right places. Darkened not just with age, but with the oils from his own hands, with the sweat from his brow during a difficult repair, and with the silent tears he shed for his father after he passed, the reason he was sitting on this stage today, under the cold, judgmental gaze of Maestro De Luca, was a promise made to Eleanor, his wife of 40 years, as she lay in her bed a few months ago, her hand weak in his. "You play so beautifully, Art," she had whispered, her voice faint. "All these years, it's been for me and the children. But it's time, my love. It's time someone else heard it." She made him promise he would audition for the Philharmonic. It sounded like a crazy, impossible dream, but he had promised her. He was doing it for her and for his father's memory, to finally set free the music he had kept locked away for so long. As he looked out at the dimly lit hall, he saw the faint shapes of the committee members, their faces shadowed. He couldn't make out their expressions, but he could feel their collective impatience. It was a physical force, pushing against him. But then, he closed his eyes. He shut out the hall, the committee, the pressure. He pictured his little workshop. He could almost smell the wood shavings. He remembered the weight of his wife's head on his shoulder as she fell, asleep listening to him play a simple melody in their living room. He remembered the look of pure pride on his father's face the first time Arthur had played a song back to him, perfectly by ear. He felt the worn, smooth wood of the cello against his body, an old friend that had shared all of his life's quiet moments. He wasn't Arthur Pinter, the retired repairman, anymore. He was a son, a husband, a father. He was the keeper of his father's songs, and he was about to finally share them. The worn cello in his hands didn't just feel like an instrument. It felt like a vessel holding a lifetime of longing and love. He took a slow, deep breath, and in the stillness of his own mind, he prayed he could make them hear it. The maestro's patience, a finite resource on the best of days, was beginning to evaporate. He watched as the old man, Arthur, moved with the unhurried pace of a farmer surveying his land after a long winter. There was no urgency, no anxiety, no sense that he was in one of the most prestigious audition halls in the country, being judged by some of the most discerning ears in the world. To DeLuca, this was not a sign of calm. It was a sign of disrespect. It was the casual disregard of an amateur who didn't understand the gravity of the space he occupied. DeLuca leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking softly under his weight. He steepled his fingers, his dark eyes fixed on the stage. He could feel the rest of the committee shifting in their seats, their own patience wearing thin. They had been at this since 9 o'clock in the morning. It was now late afternoon, and the promise of going home was the only thing keeping them alert. He let out a slow, controlled breath, a technique he used to manage his temper. But he could feel a familiar heat building behind his ribs. This was his life's work, this orchestra. He had fought for it, bled for it, poured every ounce of his soul into it. He saw it as a living, breathing entity, a guardian of a flame that was in danger of being extinguished by a world that valued speed and volume over beauty and depth. And now this. This hobbyist was treating his sacred temple like a Sunday afternoon park bench. He could hear the faint, almost imperceptible whisper from the oboe player 2 seats down. He's tuning the G-string again. For the third time, there was a ripple of suppressed, tired laughter. It was the kind of comment that was meant to be private. But in the pin-drop silence of the hall, it traveled straight to the maestro's ears. It confirmed what he already thought. They were all thinking it. This was a waste of time. A formality they had to endure before they could finally grant the one remaining chair in the cello section to the brilliant, ambitious young man from the Juilliard School who had auditioned that morning. The decision had practically been made already. This was just the last tick of a box. DeLuca had had enough. The slow tuning, the quiet reverence, the complete lack of Bialyan anxiety, it was all an act. A charade of wisdom that the maestro found offensive. He was not a man who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake, but he was a man who believed in clarity. He believed in cutting through the noise to get to the truth. And he decided in that moment that the only way to get this man off the stage was to force him to reveal his own mediocrity. He would give him a task so simple, so elementary, that any attempt at grand interpretation would only serve to highlight his lack of formal training. He would make it impossible for him to succeed. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the velvet table. The movement was sharp, decisive, and it cut through the quiet of the hall like a knife. He did not raise his voice, but the cold, clipped tone of his words carried an undeniable authority that made everyone, including Arthur on the stage, freeze. "Mr. Pinter," he called out. The sound of his own voice in the silent hall was satisfyingly harsh. "We are on a rather tight schedule. We do not have the luxury of a full program. Perhaps a single piece will suffice." The insult was subtle but clear. He was treating him like a child at a school recital. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He chose the piece with surgical precision. The Bach cello Suite No. 1 in G major. The Prelude. "If you please." Quiet, collective exhale passed through the committee. Of course, the Prelude. It was the hello world of the cello repertoire. It was the first piece any serious student learned. It was technically simple, a flowing stream of 16th notes that didn't require the flashy pyrotechnics of a concerto. On the surface, it was a gift, a kind choice. But in the context of this audition, for this level of orchestra, it was a profound insult. It was the maestro's way of saying, "I don't believe you can even handle this. Show me you're as basic as I think you are, and we can all go home." The Prelude's difficulty was a trap. Its technical simplicity meant that every single flaw, every blemish of tone, every wavering of pitch would be nakedly exposed. And more than that, Its profound, heartbreaking beauty could only be unlocked by a true artist, someone who understood its architecture of emotion. De Luca was certain this old man would play it mechanically, like a student practicing his scales. He would hit the notes, but the soul of the piece would remain locked away, untouched. It was the perfect test, and in the maestro's mind, a guaranteed failure. On the stage, Arthur heard the words. He understood the piece, of course. He had played it 1,000 times since he was a boy. He also understood the tone in the maestro's voice. He felt the dismissive weight of the challenge. A younger man might have felt a surge of anger, a flash of defiance. But Arthur felt none of that. He felt only a quiet, profound sadness for the man on the table. A man who had everything: fame, talent, an orchestra of his own, but who seemed to have lost the simple joy of the music. He saw the challenge not as an insult, but as a request. The man wanted him to play. So he would play. He didn't respond. He didn't nod or acknowledge the command. He simply closed his eyes. And in doing so, he shut the door on the entire world of the audition. The cold, judgmental hall, the impatient maestro, the tired committeeette, all vanished. He was no longer sitting on a stage under a harsh spotlight. He was in his father's small living room. The year was 1958. The smell of his mother's pot roast was in the air, and the sun was streaming through the window. Dusting the worn rug with gold, his father was sitting in his favorite armchair. The big, old cello resting between his knees. His big, calloused factory hands, usually stained with grease, looked surprisingly gentle as they held the neck of the instrument. "This piece, Artie," his father was saying, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "It's like a river. It just keeps flowing. But a river isn't just one kind of water, is it? Sometimes it's fast and angry, smashing against the rocks. Sometimes it's slow and deep, and you can see all the way to the bottom. Sometimes it's just happy, gurgling along on a sunny day. You have to tell that story. You can't just play all the notes the same." His father started to play the prelude. He wasn't perfect. His timing was fluid, almost loose. A few notes were a little sharp, a little fuzzy, but it didn't matter. It was the most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard. He could hear the river his father spoke of. He could feel the current, see the sunlight on the water, hear the rush of the water over the stones. He wasn't just playing notes. He was painting a picture with sound. A memory of the streams and rivers from the old country he had left behind so many years ago. His father played with his whole body, his eyes closed, a small, peaceful smile on his face. He was completely lost in the music. He was free. "See?" his father said, stopping for a moment. "Don't be scared to let it breathe. The silence is as important as the sound. It's what gives the music its shape. It's the space between the words that makes the sentence mean something." Arthur opened his eyes, back on the stage in the vast, silent hall. But the warmth of that memory, the sound of his father's voice, remained with him, a shield against the cold. He could still feel the sun on his face. He could still smell the pot roast. He was no longer Arthur Pinter, the nervous applicant. He was his father's son, and he was about to play his father's song. He took a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs completely. He felt his shoulders relax, the tension draining out of his neck and back. The silence in the hall was different now. It wasn't heavy and judgmental anymore. It was clean and empty, like a fresh canvas. It was a silence that was waiting. It was an invitation. He reached for the bow, his fingers finding the familiar grip of the old worn frog. The bow itself was an extension of his arm. A trusted friend that had danced across these strings for decades, he carefully placed the bow on the A string, the horsehair gripping the metal just above the bridge. The world shrank to that single point of contact. He could feel the subtle vibration of the string, a quiet hum of potential energy. The committee was frozen, their pens poised. The maestro had his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face a mask of stony, unforgiving finality. He was a statue, waiting for the inevitable, disappointing sound. Arthur didn't see him. He didn't see any of them. He saw only the river, and he knew it was time to set it flowing. He flexed his wrist, feeling the weight of the bow in his hand. and with a quiet, gentle pressure, prepared to pull the first sound from the heart of the old wood. Then the first note played. It wasn't a note in the way the committee understood notes. It wasn't a clean, sharp, textbook perfect G. It was a sound that seemed to well up from the very floorboards of the old hall. A deep, resonant hum that felt more like a voice than an instrument. It was warm, impossibly warm, like the first sip of hot coffee on a freezing morning. It was a sound that had been steeped in time. It carried within its vibration the echo of 1,000 quiet evenings in a dusty workshop. It didn't just enter their ears. It seemed to settle somewhere deep inside their chests, a gentle, resonant hum that awakened a forgotten part of them. On the stage, Arthur's eyes were still closed. His bow moved with a slow, steady pull, not with the aggressive, precise stroke of a performer trying to impress, but with the gentle, confident pressure of a storyteller beginning his tale. He was not just playing a note, he was releasing a memory. The note hung in the air, thick and alive, shimmering for a moment before it began to breathe, to swell and recede like a slow, deep wave. It had character. It had a beautiful human floor, slight, almost imperceptible waver that was not a mistake of technique, but a quiver of emotion. It was the sound of a held breath, a heart full of a feeling too big for words. The smirk on Maestro Vincenzo De Luca's face did not just fade. It vanished. It was as if someone had wiped it clean away with a cloth. His entire body, which had been coiled in a knot of impatient dismissal, went utterly still. His piercing eyes, which had been narrowed in judgment, flew wide open. The condescending scowl was replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated shock. It was the look of a man who had spent his life studying the geography of a country, only to discover a new, vast, uncharted continent rising from the sea. He leaned forward so abruptly in his chair that the front legs lifted off the ground for a second before slamming back down. The sudden noise was a sacrilege, a violent interruption of the sacred sound, but no one even noticed. All attention was riveted on the stage. The first note connected to the next, and then the next, and the familiar flowing melody of the Bach prelude began to unfold. But it was not the melody they knew. This was not the pristine, mathematically perfect version they had heard 100 times from students and virtuosos. Arthur's timing was fluid, almost spoken. He would linger on a note just a fraction of a second longer than expected, letting its warmth spread through the hall like honey. Then he would rush forward, a cascade of notes tumbling over each other like a giggling brook. He wasn't following a metronome. He was following a heartbeat. His own, the other members of the committee, were equally transfixed. The concertmaster, a woman who had played for 30 years and thought she had heard every possible interpretation of the piece, slowly lowered her pen. It dangled from her fingers, forgotten. Her mouth was slightly agape. She wasn't just hearing the music. She was seeing it. She could see a sun-dappled river, just as Arthur's father had described it. She could see a little boy sitting on a rug watching his father play, his face filled with wonder. The music was painting pictures in her mind, vivid and real. The principal oboist, a man known for his own technical brilliance and his cynical nature, felt a strange and unwelcome pricking behind his eyes. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. It was the sound of longing, of a quiet, unspoken ache that he recognized deep in his own bones. It was the sound of the life you live, the one filled with duty and routine, and the life you dream of, the one you put away in a drawer long ago. Arthur's cello was opening that drawer. Arthur himself was no longer in the hall. He was on that riverbank with his father. As his fingers, which were not the slender, nimble fingers of a professional, danced along the fingerboard, he wasn't thinking about the position of his hand or the angle of his bow. He was letting his muscle memory, his soul's memory, guide him. He remembered his father telling him about the angry water, the parts of the river that rushed and crashed. His bow pressure increased, his tempo quickened, and the music became a torrent, a powerful, driving force that was filled not with rage but with a fierce, life-firming energy. The sound swelled, filling every corner of the vast auditorium, pushing against the walls and the high ceiling until it felt like the hall itself was about to take flight. Then, just as suddenly, the torrent subsided. His touch on the strings became feather-light. The tempo slowed to a crawl. The music became quiet, introspective, a deep, still pool where you could see your own reflection. This was the part his father called the deep water, the place for secrets. The notes were sparse, each one given its own space to resonate, to be felt. In the silence between the phrases, there was a story of loss, of saying goodbye. It was the sound of a quiet workshop, now empty. The smell of sawdust, a fading memory. It was the sound of holding the hand of the woman you loved for 40 years as she took her last breath. It was a sound of such profound, unvarnished sadness that it was almost unbearable, and yet it was also beautiful. It was the sound of being alive. The maestro was completely undone. His arms, which had been crossed so tightly in front of him, had fallen to his sides. His hands, usually clenched in a gesture of authority, were limp on his knees. He was a statue no more. He was a man, listening. For the first time in a very long time, he was not a director critiquing a performance. He was a human being, being spoken to. This was the truth he had been searching for, the soul he had been demanding, and it was coming from the one person he had dismissed as a fool. He felt a wave of shame so intense it was almost physical. His arrogance, his impatience, his cruel little test all seemed so pathetic and small in the face of this monumental, honest sound. The man wasn't playing the notes. He was letting his life flow out through the wood and the strings. The music continued its journey. It flowed from sorrow to a gentle, resilient hope. It was the sound of the sun coming out after a long rain. It was the sound of a promise made and a promise kept. The melody began to dance again, but this time it wasn't a giddy brook. It was a steady, confident river, one that knows its own path and its own strength. There was a quiet joy in it now, a sense of peace. It was the joy of a life well lived, with all its cracks and imperfections. It was the beauty of a worn, scuffed cello case, of a tweed jacket with frayed elbows, of hands that knew the meaning of work. Arthur's physical presence was a testament to the sound he was making. There was no showy performance. He didn't sway dramatically or throw his body around. His connection to the cello was absolute, an intimate, quiet embrace. His head was bowed, his forehead almost resting on the scroll of the instrument. His shoulders moved with the phrases, rising and falling like a slow, steady breath. He was one with the music, a conduit through which a lifetime of feeling was being poured into the world. The perspiration that began to beat on his forehead wasn't from exertion. It was from emotion. He was giving everything, holding nothing back. He was keeping his promise as the final notes of the prelude began to approach. The entire committee was leaning forward, a silent, captivated audience held in thrall. They were no longer judges. They were listeners. The journey the music had taken them on was one they all understood, a universal story of love, loss, work, and endurance. The maestro's pen, which had clattered to the floor unnoticed, lay on the carpet next to his shoe. He was completely unaware of it. His entire being was focused on the man and the music. The last few notes were played softly, gently, with a sense of finality and release. And then, silence. The final note faded, not into an empty space, but into a silence that was so full of the music that had just been played that it felt like a continuation. It was a sacred silence, a shared, communal breath. No one moved. No one clapped. They were afraid to break it, afraid to shatter the fragile, beautiful thing that was still hovering in the air of the hall. It was a silence that was more profound, more meaningful than any applause could ever be. In that silence, Maestro De Luca, the great, unmovable maestro, felt a single hot tear escape his eye and trace a slow path down his weathered cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just sat there in the echoing quiet, completely and utterly humbled. He had come to this audition looking for a musician. He had found a poet, and his world would never be the same. The final note of the Bach prelude didn't just end. It dissolved. It seemed to melt into the very air of the great hall, leaving behind a silence so thick and heavy with feeling that it was almost a sound in itself. It was a shared silence, a communal held breath. It was the quiet that follows a confession or a prayer. No one dared to move. To clap would have been a profanity, a loud, clumsy gesture that would shatter the delicate, sacred atmosphere. To speak would have been impossible. The committee, a group of highly critical, highly trained musicians, sat motionless. Their professional masks gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. They were not judges anymore. They were pilgrims who had just witnessed a miracle. On the stage, Arthur slowly, carefully lowered his bow from the strings. The simple, humble movement seemed to take an enormous effort. He let his hands fall to his lap, his shoulders slumping forward as if a great weight had been lifted from them, replaced by another, equally heavy weight of vulnerability. He kept his eyes closed for a long moment, letting the silence wash over him. He had poured everything he had into those few minutes. He had given them his father, his wife, his children, his quiet life, his hidden heart. He had kept his promise. Now he was empty. He was adrift in the profound stillness he had created. He finally opened his eyes. The harsh spotlight that had felt so exposing before now seemed softer. He looked out into the dim, shadowed rows of seats at the silent, dark shapes of the people who held his future in their hands. He expected nothing. In his mind, the audition was already over. He had done what he came to do. He had played the music, spoken the language he loved, and shared it just as Eleanor had asked. He was prepared for the polite, dismissive thank you, the formal closing of a door. He was ready to gather his old, faithful cello and return to his quiet life. His final duty done, he saw a flicker of movement down in the front. It was the concertmaster. She had picked up her fallen pen, but she wasn't looking at her evaluation sheet. Her face, illuminated by the small lamp on the table, was a picture of astonishment and deep, moving emotion. Her eyes were shining. Another member of the committee, the principal cellist, a man with a reputation for being a formidable and intimidating presence, had his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking in a way that was not from laughter. They were not judging him. They were ... what? He couldn't quite understand the looks on their faces. It was something he had never seen before in a place like this. Then, another movement. This one from the center of the table drew his attention. It was the maestro, Vincenzo De Luca, the great, fearsome maestro. He was standing. The movement was slow, almost reverent. He pushed his chair back with a hand that was not quite steady and rose to his feet. This was a gesture so unheard of in the history of these auditions that it was more shocking than if he had started shouting. The maestro did not stand for candidates. The maestro did not show emotion. The maestro judged. Yet here he was, a solitary figure rising from the shadows. His formidable presence diminished, replaced by something else entirely. He began to walk. He didn't come down the aisle. He walked up the 3 steps to the stage, his shoes making soft, deliberate sounds on the wooden floor. The stage was Arthur's territory, his small, safe world. But now it was being entered by this titan of the musical world. Arthur watched him approach, a strange mix of fear and curiosity in his heart. The maestro stopped a few feet away, close enough for Arthur to see the details of his face in the dim light. He saw the lines etched around his eyes and mouth, lines that spoke of a lifetime of concentration and strain. But he also saw something else. His eyes, which had been so hard and judgmental just minutes before, were now soft, glistening, and filled with an emotion Arthur could only describe as awe. And there, on his weathered cheek, was the faint, drying track of a single tear. The maestro opened his mouth to speak. He seemed to be searching for words, as if the entire vocabulary he had spent his life cultivating had suddenly become useless. He didn't say bravo or magnificent or any of the standard, empty words of praise. He looked past Arthur at the old worn cello still cradled in his hands, a look of profound understanding on his face. He then looked back at Arthur's face, at the tired eyes, at the kind, humble lines around his mouth. He finally spoke, his voice a low, rough whisper that was stripped of all its usual command and authority. It was just a voice, a human voice. How? How long? He asked, the words coming out with difficulty. Have you been waiting to share that with someone? The question was so unexpected, so gentle and perceptive, that it struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a question about his musical training or his technical skills. It was a question about his life. It was a question that saw straight through the cello, through the audition, through the hall, and touched the very core of his 40 years of silent private music. It acknowledged the weight of all those years, all that held back feeling. Arthur felt his own throat tighten. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. How long had he been waiting? Since he was a boy watching his father? Since the day he put his own dreams away to build a life for his family? Since the day Eleanor whispered her dying wish? The answer was forever. The answer was his whole life. He couldn't possibly say all that. He could only shake his head slowly, a small, tired, and deeply sad smile touching his lips. He was an old man, and this was his entire life story, and he had just told it in 4 minutes. And this man, this great maestro, had understood. The maestro nodded, his own eyes misting over again. He didn't need to hear the words. He understood the shake of the head. He understood the tired smile. He understood everything. He had spent his entire career trying to teach young musicians how to find the story in the notes. And here was a man who didn't need to be taught. The story was his own. De Luca took another small step closer. He gestured not to Arthur, but to the cello. That instrument, he said, his voice still a whisper, it is not just wood. It is a book. And you are the only one who knows how to read it. Arthur looked down at the old cello, at the worn places where his own hands had rested for decades. He saw it not as an instrument, but as his father's hands, his wife's laughter, his children's childhoods. He saw it as a testament to a life of quiet love. The maestro was right. They stood there in the silence for another moment. 2 men from different worlds who had just met on a bridge of shared understanding. The audition committee remained frozen in their seats, witnesses to a scene that would become a legend in the orchestra's history. Finally, the maestro spoke again, his voice gaining a little of its old strength. But now it was the strength of conviction, not authority. "We have no chair for you in the section, Mr. Pinter," he said, and Arthur's heart sank a little, just as he had expected. It was a kind offer, a moment of connection, but the reality of the world was returning. But then the maestro continued. "We have no chair for you, because a chair is just a seat. And what you have to offer is not something that can be contained in a single seat in a row." He took a breath, as if he was about to propose something radical, something that would change the very fabric of his orchestra. "I want you to be a part of this family. Not as a regular member. I want you to be our storyteller. Our soul. I don't know what your title will be. We will create one for you. But I want you here. I want the young musicians, the ones who play the notes perfectly, to sit and listen to you. I want them to learn what a note can hold." He looked Arthur straight in the eye, his gaze now intense, with a new kind of purpose. "You will not be required to play the standard repertoire every night, but when you do, you will play. And you will teach. You will teach us all what it means to listen." Arthur just stared at him, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what was being offered. It wasn't a job. It was an invitation. It was a validation of his entire existence. It was the recognition that his quiet, private life had a value he had never dared to imagine. "I don't know what to say," Arthur stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," the maestro said. And for the first time, a genuine warm smile spread across his face, softening all the hard lines and making him look years younger. "You have already said it all." He reached out and, for a brief moment, placed a hand gently on Arthur's shoulder. It was a gesture of respect, of welcome, of gratitude. Then he turned and walked back to his table. His posture changed, his spirit lightened. He sat down, picked up his pen, and wrote 2 words on the evaluation form. "Hire him." Arthur slowly began to pack up his cello, his hands trembling slightly. As he placed it back in its worn, scuffed case, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had come to this audition to fulfill a promise to a ghost. He was leaving with a new purpose given to him by the living. The director had smirked at the man who took the seat. But the man who played the first note had, in those few, short minutes, taught the entire orchestra what it truly meant to have a soul. And as he walked down the aisle and out the door, back into the bright light of the afternoon, he wasn't just a retired instrument repairman anymore. He was Arthur Pinter, the keeper of stories. And his story was finally ready to be heard.